All right. My name is Ann Rose Kitagawa. We're going to have a gallery talk now, so people who are interested in just seeing the exhibition, of course, you are welcome to look around as you like, but we do have a very special opportunity here today to hear from the curator of the exhibition, Professor Ben Saunders. I'm Ann Rose Kitagawa. I'm chief curator of the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. I'm a specialist in Asian art, but a great fan of comics, and I am absolutely delighted and so proud that this museum is hosting, I believe, the fourth now of a series of comics-related exhibitions. This one, Aliens, Monsters, and Madmen, the brainchild, whatever that says, about Professor Ben Saunders, our distinguished professor of English, and just this week, the recipient of a very wonderful award from the Fund for Faculty Excellence, given to only 15 professors for the excellence in their teaching. So Ben, as you probably know, is the primogenitor of our comics studies program. He is the driving force, the engine of that, and one of the most beloved teachers on campus. He's also a great friend and collaborator of this museum. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ben Saunders.
Well, hi everyone. Whoa, hi everyone, and thanks for coming. Oh, hi, and I'm going to say a special shout out to my daughter over there who just arrived. Hi, Bronwyn. I hope you have a question prepared. So, yes, thanks again for coming, everybody. This is quite a text-heavy show, so some of what I have to say will be repetitions of material that you can just read off of the walls, and I apologize for any redundancy about that. I don't mean to make any presumptions about people's abilities to read. But the way that I'll say a few words about the layout of the show and the way it was designed, which is why I initially asked you to sort of gather in this area. And then we will move to a few of the different artworks where I'll just point out some of my favorite details. And then I think one of the things that I would like to encourage people to do is just to take in the show at their own pace, and I'll hang around, and if people have questions for me, I can answer them. So to begin with, when you come up either of the big sets of stairs up here, you see this big block of text when you come in, and it's the same block of text on either side, so you don't have to read that one twice. And I think of that as the big context. And the big context is the 1950s, and how one of the things about this, the argument of this show, if you like, to the extent that it has a thesis, is that in some ways the 1960s began in 1952 with the publication of the first issue of Mad and the first issues of Shock Suspense Stories, both key publications from the EC company. The 50s is a lot of people like to think of it as a simpler and happier time, but of course it is a period of Cold War paranoia, of backlash against women, and in response to the freedoms that women had come to enjoy in the wake of World War II, and of course a period of great racial tension and racist oppression. And all of those social realities were reflected in EC Comics in remarkable ways, in ways that I think actually make it some of the most politically daring popular culture produced in the United States in that period. At the same time, this is a turning point in terms of the history of comics. The comics medium itself is relatively young in the early 1950s, and very few people regarded it as an art form. The publishers almost without exception, were not particularly interested in the artistic merits of the medium, although a handful of creators were sort of trying to push at what could be done. Again, EC was a great exception here in that the publisher, Bill Gaines, not only paid his artists well and on time, which was itself fairly unusual at the time, but he also encouraged his artists to work in their own individual styles instead of having a house style. So, for example, one of the top-selling comic books of the 1950s. Anyone want to take a guess, by the way, what the top-selling comic book in of the early 1950s was? Or top-selling books? Any guesses? No, not Superman. Good guess, but no. Archie. Archie would have been absolutely one of the top-selling titles, which was, of course, perfectly acceptable to most parents. If you look at 1950s Archie's comics now, it's absolutely not the kind of thing that I would ever want my daughter to read. They're horrifying. The gender politics of 50s Archie comics are utterly terrifying. But that material was perfectly socially acceptable by and large. Whereas this, the material published by EC was considered a lot more controversial. Now, of course, if you were lucky enough to be an artist on Archie in the early 1950s, and you came in one day and decided, I'm going to draw Archie my way today, well, you can imagine what the results would have been. You would have been fired. The way the industry worked at that time, by and large, was that if you were, if you had a successful product, the editors and publishers would say, draw like that guy. And no, you didn't sign the work. Bill Gaines took a reverse position. He encouraged artists to draw in their own styles. He encouraged them to sign their work, and he encouraged the readers to write in and say what their favorite stories were, creating one of the first real fan communities in comics. And perhaps most remarkable of all, he warehoused the art and stored it. This is one of the reasons, the main reason we're able to do this story at all, just from the point of view of the physical existence of these objects. For most publishers of comics in this period and right up into the early 60s, the cost of warehousing this art and storing it once the comics had been published, it just didn't make economic sense to keep it. So most comic art was destroyed. Gaines, however, not only kept it all, and kept it nicely, but then when it was sold off in complete story lots in the early 1980s in a series of auctions, he sold them in complete stories so that the stories would not get broken up. That was his perception of that the work needed to be kept together. And then he split the proceeds with the artists, which he didn't have to do because he owned the art outright. So Gaines was a very remarkable and visionary publisher. And I think the rarest of all things, a good capitalist. So that's the sort of that's the basic reason that we're able to do this show at all, is because of the foresight of that of this visionary publisher, about whom you can learn more from the panels on this wall here. So the basic arrangement of the show then, that's the larger context. The detailed context about the history of the company is on this wall in front of me here. And there's a series of panels and then some key artworks, some of which I will maybe talk about in a little while. But if you want the detailed history of the rise and fall of this little company, it's all here on the walls. And I'll just give you the basic contours. So in the very early 1950s, the company was founded by a man named Max Gaines, Bill's father. Max is a very important figure in the early history of American comic books. But when but EC was an attempt initially on his part to explore what he felt was the underexploited didactic and potential of comics. So he created a company called Educational Comics, stories like picture stories from the Bible, picture stories from history. It did not sell. And the company was in pretty dire financial straits when Max Gaines was then killed in a boating accident on Lake Placid, and his son, who at the time was training to be a chemistry teacher and had no interest in comics, was begged by his mother to take over the ailing company. One of the first things that Bill Gaines had to do was just figure out how they could start making profits again. So the earliest days of the company involved chasing other popular trends. Archie was big, and so they thought, for example, about maybe trying an Archie-style book. So right there, there's something called Going Steady with Peggy. As you can see, it's one of the only uninked pieces of pencil art in the show. That's because they realized before it even went to press that there was that the market for such teen books was glutted. They couldn't compete with Archie. They tried westerns. They tried romance books, which were hugely popular at the time, and they started to do a little better, but that big hit continued to elude them. Then in the early 1950s, in 1950 they released their first horror titles, and they had their first bona fide hits. They weren't the first horror comics ever on the US market, but they were some of the first really successful ones. And I'll say a bit more about that when we're actually looking at some of the horror art. In 1952, they also released a very important satirical humor book called Mad, which is still in publication today. It's the only EC title still in publication. At this point, however, the moral panic really starts to take hold. Since the late 40s, there'd been a lot of concern expressed by parents and educators, concerns that were then exploited by demagogic politicians and inflamed by sensationalist journalists who were just, looking for whatever the 1950s equivalent of clickbait was. And there was a real mass hysteria almost about the effects of comics upon young minds. Some of those examples we've got them right here for you. We actually had these original magazine on newspaper articles laminated so that you can read them for yourselves and see what the fuss was about. So here's an extraordinary sensationalist piece from Collier's magazine talking about how comics will turn children into little murderers. And this is a depiction of that. Here we have a piece by the man who was really the public face of the attack on comics in the 1950s, Dr. Frederick Wertham. Any of you familiar with Wertham, by the way? Is that a name that people know? We have a little, in the room at the far end of the gallery, we have some clips of his Senate testimony, so you can actually hear him speaking. Wertham's sort of a fascinating figure. He was one of the first people, he was the first person to open a free mental health clinic in Harlem, amongst other things. So he's not an entirely evil person, he's a complicated figure. But he definitely seems to have, he got a real bee in his bonnet about the comics. He treated a lot of juvenile delinquents and noticed that they all read comic books, and concluded that there was a direct connection. They all chewed gum and drank milk as well, but apparently that didn't factor so importantly into his considerations. One of the things about Wertham is that as an Austrian emigre, highly educated Austrian emigre, he actually sounds almost like a sort of a cartoon psychiatrist. It really is like, these comics are having an unfortunate effect on the young people's minds. At the time, of course, this made him seem ever more impressive and credentialed to the audience of American parents. Here was someone who sounded like their idea of Freud, telling everybody what devastating psychological effects comics would have upon people. So he was taken very, very seriously. Bill Gaines, the EC publisher, was the only comics publisher to show up at the Senate hearings to testify on behalf of these comics, and it backfired. He ultimately became the face of evil for a lot of people at that time. The name associated, and the EC name became associated with the most negative comics of the period. So the company began to flounder. There was a lot of heat and backlash. They found it difficult to get their work distributed. And at the same time, as I already mentioned, the biggest selling comics in the country at the time are fairly innocuous. We're talking about Dell's Disney books and the Archie comics, amongst other things. Those publishers are making huge amounts of money producing material that nobody's really objecting to. So the publishers react to this moral panic about comics in a rather cowardly way. They realize that what they basically decided is, why are we taking all this heat for this guy, Bill Gaines, who's trying to publish more ambitious material, when we could all just form a coalition and ban all of this dangerous material and continue to make tons of money from the stuff that no one objects to. So it was not a government-down form of censorship. It was the publishers who got together and agreed to form a Comics Code Authority. You can see the stamp for the Comics Code Authority. Some of you may remember this stamp appearing on the covers of comic books right through the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And if a comic book did not have that stamp of approval on the cover, it was not allowed national distribution. It basically meant that you couldn't make any money if you didn't, as a comics publisher, if you didn't have that stamp on the cover of your books. So they banned, amongst other things, the words terror, crime, horror, and weird. All words that were in the titles of, the word weird is the giveaway. It was very clear that they were targeting Bill Gaines with these decisions, making it effectively impossible for EC to publish their books. They tried different kinds of magazines, and this last part of the timeline here is attempts for them to do other kinds of things. They tried confessional magazines, for example. I Took My Sister's Husband is a page from one of those confessional style magazines with text stories this time rather than comic stories that were heavily illustrated by their comics artists. None of them sold. The only magazine that they published that succeeded was Mad. Mad moved from being a regular comic book to a magazine with the 24th issue, thereby avoiding the Comics Code Authority. It was now officially a magazine, which means it gets racked in different places in the newsagents and so on. So Mad escaped the censor and became one of the biggest selling and popular American satirical magazines of all time. But everything else ceased publication in 1956. Amongst other things I should point out, by the way, what we have in this show, the original color studies for the cover of Mad #1, the finished art for the covers of numbers 2, 3, and 4, all on one wall. I wish I could have got the finished art for the cover of #1, but Mr. Spielberg didn't want to lend. It is in his collection. I did my best. We also have Harvey Kurtzman's cover design and finished art for the cover of the first issue of Mad as a magazine. And with an incredible border, illuminated border with all sorts of famous people from history like Freud and Socrates and Alexander the Great reading Mad magazine. And in the original art, the details are that much larger. You can see things that you just can't see on the published cover. So I recommend definitely taking a look at that. So now I'll just say a few words about how the show is divided up and then walk you over to some of my favorite pieces. So this is the history area. This is the area that tells you all that I just told you, basically, with a bit more detail. Then on this side of the room, we have the signal that you're entering the area. We've divided the show by genre. And the signal that you're entering an area with a new genre is one of the large color pieces. Those are obviously reproductions. Most of the art that you'll be looking at is not in color. The original comic art is black and white. But in order to signal that movement, we made some reproductions of some cool covers that are not in the show. And those color pieces let you know you've entered a new genre area. So over there you can see the cover of a Mad magazine. So that lets you know you're entering the satire and parody area of the show. Most of that material is from Mad. The far wall also features some of Harvey Kurtzman's war material. By the way, EC took a very bold attitude in their war comics before the publication of Mad, and it's really worth spending some time looking at the complete Kurtzman war story. Kurtzman's war comics were so anti-jingoistic and failed so badly as propaganda for American wars that J. Edgar Hoover actually started a file on him and on the publisher Bill Gaines. You know you're doing something right if Hoover starts a file on you, right? It's not actually clear to me whether Kurtzman or Gaines even knew that they were under investigation by the FBI. The files were only declassified in the late 90s, and both Kurtzman and Gaines had died before the files were declassified. So they may never have known that they were investigated. But the things that, the thing that prompted that was Kurtzman's anti-jingoistic and war comics, which were unlike any other war comics of the time period. And also, by the way, published at the height of the Korean War. Very brave material that he was doing. So that's the Mad, the satire and the war material. And behind this wall, a little more tucked away, is where you'll find the horror and the crime material. This was obviously EC's bread and butter. Their most successful comics were always their horror comics. And I'll take you back there and say a little bit about that later, but that's what's there. Then over on this side, we have the science fiction material. This is some of the most interesting material from the point of view not only of the illustration, but some of the most advanced writing of the period. To give you the quick story, so many of their science fiction stories were adaptations of short stories by Ray Bradbury, who is now recognized, of course, as one of the finest writers of the short story in any medium in the 20th century. They started out by stealing a couple of ideas from Bradbury, flat out plagiarizing him, but because Bradbury was a man of taste and read comic books, he noticed. And he wrote to them and said, I enjoyed the adaptation. of my work, but there seems to have been some sort of error because I didn't receive my check. And they have immediately responded with, oh, so glad you wrote. We didn't know how to reach you. Here's your check. And they engaged, because basically Bradbury was good-natured about it, they were able to enter into an official adaptation process, and they ended up officially adapting 22 of Bradbury's stories, all with the approval of Bradbury himself, which means that EC was publishing some of the most literate and sophisticated science fiction comics of the 1950s. So that's the basic division, and then finally, in the sort of the extra gallery space at the end of the small room at the end of the gallery, we have a video. This was an anthology actually compiled by some of my students. I gave them some materials and said, make me a 12-minute film about EC, and they did, so that's what's there. And also a couple of vitrines containing memorabilia and some of the actual printed comics for comparison purposes, so you can see them. Okay, so with that said and the basic organization explained, I think I'd like to go over and have a look at some of Wally Wood's stuff in the science fiction section. Maybe we'll do one other thing after that, and then people can wander around as they like, and I'll take questions. It's really hard to know where to begin with a show like this because there are so many different genres, and I've already mentioned the political controversy and the bravery of this company. And it's very easy just to talk about sociology when talking about the 1950s and EC, and to forget that these also happen to be some of the most finely drawn comics of the 1950s. So to change pace a little bit now, that's really what I'd like to talk about, and it seems like one of the best places to begin is with the work of Wally Wood, affectionately known as Wally in a lot of printed information, although I actually think his friends called him Woody, not Wally. I don't think he ever went by Wally in his own, amongst his friends. So Wood is an interesting and somewhat tragic figure. He was a true obsessive. After I move away, I really want you to come in and take a sort of, if you want to come in and take a close look at these pages, because I've shown these to people and they can't believe that they're not looking at printed work, that this is the fact that this is actually the boards upon which this man labored with a pen and a brush truly astonishes people. This is also some of the material that I think just can't be reproduced because of the kinds of layering of paper and techniques that Wood would use, producing almost three-dimensional objects here. I'll just start with a description of the art and then say a bit more about Wood as a man. So this is a complete story by Wood called My World. It was written for him by Al Feldstein as kind of a tribute to Wood's own love for comics. And the world that is being referred to in the text turns out to be the world of comics. So he begins by saying, this is my world, the world I love. It's a steaming tropical swamp with dinosaurs, or, it's the world of grim-faced men sitting before the batteries and gauges and dials and levers and buttons of a spaceship, or it's this world of alien creatures and so on. And it actually turns out to be the world inside Wally Wood's head. And in the very final page of the story, you'll see there's Wood himself drawing this page that he's working on. So it's this sort of meta comic book moment, which makes this, I think, one of the very first self-reflexive genre comics probably ever published. And at the time, as a love letter to the medium, this was itself sort of distinctive. This may be the reason why Wood really went over the top in terms of his rendering of this work. You can see other examples of his work that maybe indicate his more usual level of effort. Say, for example, on the wall behind, the amazing story, Transformation Completed, you can see that he didn't put this level of detail and intensity as he's put into My World into everything he did. There's a reason for that. These guys were not paid by the detail. They were paid by the page. So the way that Wood has worked here is economically senseless. The only reason to do what he has done here is because he loved it and wanted to do it. And he almost certainly would have lost money given the amount of time and effort that he will have put into the pages here. So any of you ever make a mixtape for anyone? Are you familiar with this phenomenon? You know how there's kind of a rule when you make mixtapes that you should not have 2 songs by the same musician in a row? You got to, because that's not really a mix, right? Unless you really have a reason for doing that. This is Wally Wood's attitude towards shading and contrast in this work. So to choose one of the middle pages here, in every single individual panel, he uses a different technique to produce gray tones and contrasts. So in the first panel, which is working directly onto the surface of the board, he is using pencil, ink, and brush. So all the effects of gray tone are essentially the results of varying thickness of a brush line. In the second panel, he's cut, if you come up close, you'll be able to see this, he's cut a hole in his page and put a piece of coquille paper behind the hole in the page for the second panel. Coquille paper is a textured paper, so that when you work on it with like a pastel or something like that, you'll get a granular, almost charcoal kind of effect. Now, obviously, charcoal's no use for comics because you need something that can handle reproduction, and charcoal just falls off the page. So he's used a grease pencil to produce the effects of gray tone on the second panel, working with the edge of a grease pencil on a rough surface. Then in the third panel, he's cut another hole in the page and stuck on what is known as duotone paper or craft tint board. This is a really fascinating material that is no longer made. The whole of the first page is actually done with this technique of craft tint. Craft tint paper was a chemically treated paper that when you painted on it with another chemical, it would give you various gray tones. So if you used, now the gray tones would come out as a fine dot matrix, right? So it could be reproduced. So if you use one kind of chemical, you'd get a lighter shade of gray, and if you used another chemical, you get a darker shade of gray. So when you paint directly onto the board, you're sort of drawing out of the surface of the board what was there. So the effect of depth of field of the forest behind the dinosaurs in this first panel is all created with this duotone effect, basically painting with a chemical and a brush onto the board and drawing out the gray tones, and then using ink and a brush and pen to fill in the remaining details. So this whole board is that kind of paper, and then whenever he wants to use it elsewhere in the story, he has to cut a hole in his board to use it because he's varying things up. So to repeat, brush and pen, coquille paper with a grease pencil, a duotone board, and a chemistry set. Then in the fourth panel, he returns to the basic surface of the board, but now he produces his gray tones with something called zippertone. Any of you familiar with zippertone? Isn't it awesome? Zippertone's great. Zippertone is essentially a gray dot matrix on a transparency with a sticky reverse back, so that when you placed it over the artwork and then cut around it with an X-Acto knife and then stick it on, you get your effects of gray tone that way. So there are 2 kinds of zippertone used in this fourth panel, as well as the brush technique. In the 5th panel, he's reverted back to the duotone board, and then in the 6th panel, he's back on the surface of this paper using mostly the brush and ink, but there's a piece of zippertone on the side here giving you this effect here. And then one of my favorite details, he's gone for the explosion, this is a spaceship blowing up, and for the effects of the explosion, he's used a knife or maybe a razor blade, but some kind of edged tool to gouge out little pieces of shrapnel or explosive from out of the black ink that he's applied to the surface of the page. So if you come in close, and I have to say, they tell me I'm doing something they don't like you to, don't touch the glass, the people will object to that. But if you put your hands behind your back, you can lean in as close as you like, and you can see how he's worked on this with a knife. And that's just one page. Now this is a technique that he then reproduces on all of the subsequent pages. How long did Wood take to do this kind of thing? Well, according to people who knew him, he'd work 12-hour days. He had a mattress by the board. He was a control freak and an alcoholic. He basically seems to have functioned drawing. Although Harvey Kurtzman said about him that he that he was a sweet guy, but that all his emotions came out on the page. That lust came out on the page, anger came out on the page, joy came out on the page, and away from the boards, it was like he didn't know how to express an emotional life at all. So he would smoke and drink coffee. You can see traces of the brown liquid stains on the bottom of this page. He would smoke and drink coffee and draw all day, and then he would drink at night. He had his first stroke at the age of 51. And after a series of strokes, he committed suicide at the age of 53 when he could his drawing hand was paralyzed by the final stroke and he could no longer draw. When he couldn't draw, he killed himself. Along the way, he did manage to find time to get married 3 times. The second time to one of his therapists. I gotta tell you, that's a bad therapist. And that's Wally Wood, notorious for these long hours at the board, producing this exquisite work. Well, you get to he suffered for it, and you get to decide whether it was worth it today. So that's some of my favorite science fiction material. I will say on the wall over there, really remarkable Wood story, showing him working at a faster rate, but it's no less worthy of attention. And that story is particularly remarkable just because of the extraordinary gender-switching plot. So again, by the standards of the 1950s, a really radical tale. I'll let people read the summary and the story. I won't spoil it for you, but it's a good one. Okay, maybe we should look at some of the MAD material and then see where people want to go from there and what your endurance level is. So this image this is also Wallace Wood, by the way, but that's not the reason I'm pointing it out. I'm pointing it out because this is an image from what they used to call one of their preachies. The politics of EC was not accidental. They were very self-conscious and brave in taking on things like not just racism in the Great Story Judgment Day, which is back in the science fiction area, but also McCarthyism. Joe McCarthy had not been discredited and really was in a position to ruin lives at this point. So I think of this image as the Donald Trump rally image. What you see here are a group of people beating up another man for having different political beliefs, while someone in the background says, stop it, please, what you're doing is wrong, act like Americans. This is very on the nose, it's not subtle. They're beating this man because they think he's a communist. So this is an anti-McCarthyite tale about the Red Scare. The story that this illustration comes from was called The Patriot. The part of the story involves a group of men who see another man at a political rally where the flag goes by, and he fails to take off his hat to salute the flag, so that they conclude he is a communist and beat him to death. And it is only after they've beaten him that they realize, or it is revealed, that he was in fact a veteran blinded in the most recent conflict who didn't take his hat off when the flag went by because he couldn't see it. So those kinds of stories were also part of EC's stock in trade, and I think actually were one of the reasons that people came after them, much more probably than what now seems the relatively tame horror and crime material, was this explicitly political and anti-McCarthyite stuff. So this wall is the Basil Wolverton wall. Wolverton's the only Oregon-born artist in the show, actually, which is one of the reasons it's worth drawing attention to him, and a unique stylist. Very hard to, I describe his style as exorbitant, but I'm not sure really, I think that's just me fumbling for a way to try and catch at the extraordinary rendering of his work. You can see, if you are fans of comics, particularly underground comics of the 1960s, you can see Robert Crumb's sort of origins in the work of someone like Wolverton. Bill Gaines himself said he couldn't stand the way that Wolverton drew. He found it repellent. And I think that's about right, actually. One of the most interesting things about Wolverton is that it's not, the way he draws is as off-putting as the things that he draws. So he was selected by Kurtzman to do this famous parody of Life magazine. One of the reasons we've included this Life magazine here is just so that you can see the sorts of things that what the target was. Otherwise, the context for this kind of cover is not very clear. The covers of Mad, when it was a comic book in those early days, were the real gems. They were something that they thought about a lot in terms of letting people know that this was a different kind of thing. And Mad was a hit in a way that none of their other comics were a hit, in that it was read by people who didn't read any other comics. Television personalities like Steve Allen read Mad magazine. Hugh Hefner, at the time when he was still really cool and not the unhappy, degenerate old man that he now is regarded as being, but when he had just started Playboy and was a real hipster, was someone who read Mad magazine. These were people who would not read other kinds of comics, and certainly not superhero comics, but probably not crime and horror comics either, but they read Mad. Mad was not just a badge of hipster identification, however. It was also, I think, for a lot of people, the first time that they really encountered truly subversive ideas about the culture, the popular culture in which they lived. And the American satirical tradition is perhaps not as rich as, say, in countries such as France. There's a cruelty to satire which seems to be at odds, I think, with a sort of a cliched notion of American politeness. And the folks at Mad managed, however, to produce a uniquely American strain of satire without being able to, I don't want to make you all move around and point out individual details. I'll just point out some of the key things that are in here besides these remarkable covers by Wolverton. So on that wall over there, there's a story called Howdy Do It, which is a parody of the Howdy Doody TV show. It's one of the first television parodies that they did in Mad. And again, it's a remarkable thing. This is at the height of the medium. The medium is brand new. How many of you know the Howdy Doody show? There's some of you, okay, most of you. So I had to have this explained to me. So it turns out that, well, apparently the Howdy Doody show is one of the first really successful national children's television programs in the United States, which means that it's a monster of commercialism. You could buy the Howdy Doody doll and the Howdy Doody puzzles and the Howdy Doody flatware and the Howdy Doody coloring set and this and that. I mean, it was a merchandising bonanza. And so one of the things that this story is about it reflects Kurtzman and the Mad team's ambivalence about the idea of using children's entertainment to make massive amounts of money. So they keep stopping the show. It shows you it's basically the filming of an episode of the show, which is continually interrupted by commercial breaks for increasingly useless and repugnant sounding items, like something called bup goo, which makes milk look like beer. That's one of the products that they sell. Or a repulsive-looking bread called squashies, or a nasty-looking breakfast cereal. And each time the Howdy Doody doll tells the kids in the audience, if your parents won't buy you this is what you should do. You need to really throw a fit in the supermarket aisle. You need to roll around and shout, I want it, I want it. You hold your breath until you turn blue. You make your parents buy this stuff. And then the story ends with a kind of meditation on the kinds of people we want to raise. Do we want to raise a society? Do you want to raise children to be good little capitalist consumers? Is that really the goal of children's television? This is from 1954. I mean, it's a stunning piece of work in the context of the era. I'll point out one more detailed cover, and then I think I'd just like to invite people to really take in the show and let me know if you have any questions about this stuff. So I already mentioned what happened to the company and how they were ultimately forced out of business by this moral panic against comics. There's a wonderful Mad cover which comments on this material just over on this experience, I should say, over on this wall. So this is the cover for Mad number 16. Every cover marks something different. There was one which I didn't have here because you wouldn't get the gag, but there is an issue of Mad from which this story comes, which with the cover was deliberately printed upside down. So if you were reading Mad on the subway in New York, everyone would think you were reading the comic book upside down. That was the kind of thing that they did. This one is a parody of a newspaper, obviously, as opposed to a magazine. And Kurtzman has used this inkwash style to produce a kind of the effect of photography, although they're obviously cartoons when you come in close. So this is in a direct response to Dr. Wortham's claims that comics are corrupting the minds and morals of children. I mean, it's not an exaggeration. The rhetoric that they used was extraordinarily inflammatory, and they were saying things like corrupting the morals of minors. A direct comparison was being drawn between the production of comics and pedophilia. This is what they were essentially accused. You were one notch above child molester if you produced comics in this period, according to the people who hated you. So they've responded by showing a raid by the police on a group of comics creators. So they have the crime comics writer who's got his fedora pulled low over his face, the science fiction comics writer who's clearly an alien with 3 eyes here, and the lampoonist, that's the people who do Mad, shown as a lunatic in a straitjacket, and they're all being arrested by the police for producing this stuff. And then you have even more splendidly, the image here. This is publisher Bill Gaines. You'll be able to recognize him from the pictures on the walls over there, holding a comic book which he's surreptitiously giving to obviously a young reader on a street corner, as if he's handing him, like a bag of drugs or something like that. Like this. Here's a copy of a comic book, kid. So they're embracing the image, the media image that has been projected onto them of being a kind of the publishing equivalent of pedophiles and drug dealers. And here they are just sort of embracing the absurdity of that image. It's a wonderful cover, and I hope you get a chance to look a little bit more closely at it. And of course, it's right next to this extraordinary piece of art that I already mentioned, which shows Kurtzman's frame and design for the first issue of Mad when it became a magazine. The frame stuck around for the next 5 or 6 issues of Mad. That lettering for the cover logo has remained unchanged to the present. That's a good design. More than a century later, if you pick up a copy, more than a half century later, if you pick up a copy of Mad, it still has this logo on the front. I think this is probably a pretty good point to let people wander around the show for themselves and take things in. I'll hang around for a little while, though, and if you do have any questions, please just let me know. I'll be happy to answer them if I can. Thank you all for coming.